Welcome to Social Science 180. I hope you'll all enjoy the class and take from it some information that will benefit you and give you some new perspectives about our nation. I'm not sure what you are expecting from the course, but I can tell you that you will be reviewing lots of information related to our country's social development. Some of what you learn might be familiar to you, especially if you have a few years on you or if you like history. I'm hoping that even if lots of the material is familiar to you, that our authors will give you some detail or some perspective that brings the information to life for you and gives it some newness. You also need to be prepared for some uncomfortable truths about how our nation has dealt with different groups that came to take refuge under Lady Liberty's lamp. Lots of times we hear the term nation of nations kicked around to describe the diversity that is so apparent in our country. Walk through any mall and you can see a variety of people that might look different and speak a variety of languages. With diversity continually growing among our population, we have a tendency to focus on how different we all are from each other. Much of that has to do with how recently many of us have arrived in the U.S., and with how much we have been assimilated into the mainstream culture. Since most of us have been around for just a few generations, we still tend to see ourselves as Mexican or German or Greek or something else. Even Native Americans who have been here for 5 centuries or more refer to themselves by their tribal groups. How is it then that people become Americans? The main path has traditionally been that of assimilation. This is where newcomers over time abandon their own cultures and ways of life and conform to and adopt the American culture and its ways of life. Historically, many groups have fallen in line with this process and became absorbed into the American mainstream. More recently, however, the rise of diversity has raised questions about whether assimilation is the only path. Portis and Rambaud report that the presence of so many recent and not so recent immigrants at different stages of Americanization show that traditional assimilation might not be the only path. Our authors walk us through a popular view of traditional assimilation as it relates to various groups that came to America during a brief period of our history. You might have seen some examples of this traditional view of assimilation in books you might have read or in some movies you might have seen. It's a pretty typical pattern that some of you might recognize as you look at your own families. At first, the newcomer is faced with a number of challenges that must be dealt with in order to survive or progress in the new culture. Changes will need to be made in language, attire, beliefs, etc. Even if the newcomer might not want to embrace the new culture, the immediate necessities make it difficult to resist. The first generation newcomer might hold on to various aspects of the mother culture. The second generation is more exposed to the American culture and may learn of the mother culture from their parents and family. But it is the third generation that completely embraces the mainstream culture while identifying with some elements of the mother culture. It's this third generation, according to this popular view, that is fully Americanized and reaps the benefits of belonging to the mainstream culture. The three-generation process applies to a number of groups that came to America between 1880 and 1924. But our authors tell us that assimilation doesn't always lead to the same place. How is it then that some individuals or groups become or don't become assimilated into our society? American Indians have not assimilated into American society via the three-generation process. They have actually become more attached to their heritage, and many are returning to their ancestral ways and beliefs. They are an example of how a group may not become Americanized via the typical process. African American and Mexican Americans are two more examples of groups who don't fit the three-generation mold and continue to be not fully assimilated. Our authors now take us through a variety of factors that might influence whether or not a group will readily assimilate into the mainstream of American culture. In virtually every society, there will be one group that is dominant over others. This group enjoys greater social power and is often in a position where they have control or influence over the subordinate groups within the society. Dominant groups are usually larger and form the majority within the society. In such situations, the relationship between the two groups becomes crucial. The amount of control the dominant group exercises over the subordinate groups determines to a great extent how the groups will get along. Some dominant groups are exclusionary and tend to segregate themselves from the subordinate groups, while others choose to congregate and not segregate themselves. The tendencies of the dominant group and their attitudes toward the subordinate group will have a great influence over how or whether or not assimilation will take place. Some immigrants come to America voluntarily, others do not. This can greatly determine how readily they are willing to assimilate. Those who come voluntarily, by and large, are more ready to embrace the American way of life than those who were conquered or enslaved. Either way, both groups may see both pros and cons to Americanization. Many groups hold a strong loyalty to their ways and customs and may wish to identify more fully with their ancestral heritage and resist assimilation completely, or often maintain fidelity to their heritage in certain aspects of their lives, such as religion. Sometimes whether or not a group assimilates has a great deal to do with how many there are and how close they are to each other. The larger a minority group becomes, the more likely that the majority group rejects them or sets up barriers, both social and physical, such as apartheid or segregation. We often see minority groups segregated into their own neighborhoods, and even darker examples of segregation that we have seen in our nation's own recent history. If the receiving country is in tough economic straits when a new group arrives, the welcome will most likely be cold. Timing and the length of time a group has been in the country also play into whether or not a group will be accepted. The differences between the majority and the minority cultures is important as well. The more alike they are, the more likely they will be assimilated. Similarities in language and religious beliefs and practices are critical. Those whose languages and religious beliefs are markedly different from English and the Judeo-Christian beliefs might not be as readily welcomed, or they may find the American culture offensive or unappealing. Our authors next walk us through assimilation theory and its development over the years. They begin by recognizing that the traditional three-generation assimilation process is not without controversy. This should be apparent in light of the information we've just covered. Robert E. Park's theory of assimilation is the most influential and focuses on 4 stages: contact, competition, accommodation, and eventual assimilation. Parks claims that these stages are universal and that they represent the way it's always been everywhere. He did eventually concede that some societies will include a permanent racial minority. Later, Hansen found that grandchildren sometimes regressed to their roots and renewed their ties to their mother cultures. This went against Park's assertion that such ties were erased over time. Handlin, in the meantime, found that the Irish in Boston were never fully assimilated, but continued to be seen as outsiders who were beneath other groups that were more fully assimilated. Kennedy found that religious preferences kept groups from intermarrying with others. Then, as racial unrest reared its head, assimilation took a back seat to ethnic pluralism and conflict as groups made efforts to assert themselves. The terms race and ethnicity have been given many meanings over time, and the difference between the two is often blurred. The idea that groups may share some characteristics or ancestry may be a factor in bringing them together and give them a sense of cohesiveness or peoplehood, as our authors put it. The boundaries between the two are not what you might think. Racial group has generally been used to refer to a group's physical characteristics, while ethnic group generally refers to a group's socio-cultural aspects. Our authors do caution us, however, that although many groups do have many aspects and characteristics in common within themselves, the boundaries between and within cultural and ethnic groups are considerably more blurred than we might think. Our authors cite skin color as an example of how we might err as we attempt to differentiate between various groups. As we know, skin color varies among different groups and may not necessarily identify sharp boundaries between groups. Many times, boundaries between groups are set by choice or social agreement. Even though ethnicity is more about culture rather than physical characteristics, we still have a tendency to ascribe physical attributes to ethnicity. We also have a tendency to project derogatory images on various groups that bring about a we-they mentality. The result is the creation of in-groups and out-groups that each have various good or bad qualities associated with them. The way these groups are viewed is usually based on experience, good or bad, and these views determine whether a group will be included or excluded. Our authors tell us that we need to deal with the realities of the categories our society has created, but to remember that they can be reconstructed. Often categories are reconstructed naturally as time passes. The authors refer to certain forces of history that are able to alter such categories. As Americans, we generally believe that a person's achievements dictate their place in society rather than their ascribed characteristics. Because racial and ethnic differences are inconsistent with the realities of modern life, they should naturally decline.